CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. China's President Xi Jinping calls for unity to deal with the food and energy crisis facing the world.
Our other headlines: Ukraine continues to overshadow the G20 as world leaders meet in Bali. Russia attacks Kyiv and a number of other cities.
Heading for a recession, Eurozone growth slumps to 0.2%. High energy prices play a pivotal role in what happens next.
A tale of two cities. Paris overtakes London as Europe's highest value stock exchange. We'll be assessing the reasons why.
And the world's population hits 8 billion, according to the United Nations. That's 1 billion more people in just 12 years. Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for unity to deal with the global food and energy crisis.
Speaking at the G20 summit in Bali, President Xi said the world is witnessing momentous change unseen in a century and called for countries to abandon confrontation.
President Xi says G20 members should promote a more inclusive, more beneficial, and more resilient global development in face of various challenges. Xi also calls for an open world economy on the basis of peaceful cooperation and mutual respect. Xi says modernization is not the privilege of any country, and countries that are ahead in development should help other countries and provide more global public goods. The president notes that major countries should have the responsibility to contribute to global development. She says, under the theme of Recover Together, Recover Stronger, the G20 countries send a positive signal of supporting developing countries, avoiding world economy divergence and uneven recovery. She also calls for international cooperation and efforts in fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic and global inflation. He says countries should continue upholding multilateral trade system with the WTO as the core. The Chinese president also touches upon issues including digital economy, climate change, green transition, and food and energy security. He says China has made important contributions in those fields and has proposed a cooperation initiative on resilient global supply chain, along with 6 other countries including Indonesia and Serbia. She says a modernizing China will provide more opportunities for the world and make greater contribution to human progress.
President Xi Jinping has urged France to provide a fairer business environment for Chinese companies. Meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit, Xi urged French President Emmanuel Macron to encourage the EU to stay committed to an independent and positive China policy. Xi also told Macron that China's stance on the Ukraine crisis is clear and consistent. He says China stands for ceasefire, cessation of the conflict and peace talks. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris. So, Ross, what's France saying about this meeting between Presidents Xi and Macron?
Yeah, Robin, the communiqué released by the French presidency did say that both presidents have been working together on one of their shared ambitions, which is the green policies, the fight to try to prevent against biodiversity loss and also the climate emergency. They've been working together trying to support vulnerable economies as well. But there's no getting away from the top issue whenever President Xi is going to be meeting with any European leader at this G20 summit. The top line of that communique, Robin, Ukraine, and the French president saying that he expressed to President Xi his strong preoccupation with what is happening in Ukraine and Russia's, quote, choice to continue its aggression against Ukraine, that ongoing war, which is the main issue, this war that we have on our continent at the moment, that is always going to be one of the top priorities for European leaders and their continued support financially, militarily, diplomatically for Ukraine. President Xi did say that he welcomed the diplomatic channels that President Macron has tried to keep open. He has regularly tried to be in touch with the Kremlin, speaking to Vladimir Putin, urging him him to remove his forces from Ukraine, urging him to stop the aggression and try to return to the negotiating table. The French side did say that this was a meeting between the two which lasted around 43 minutes. President Macron going to President Xi's hotel before the meetings of Tuesday began for that head-to-head meeting. He spoke about the strategic partnership and bilateral issues as well, recommending to each other to continue their work to try to work together in the future on those green priorities I mentioned at the start, focusing on electric vehicles, hydrogen and further investment in renewable energy.
Ross, thank you very much. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris.
Well, the war in Ukraine is one of the many issues dominating this G20 summit and also the talks between world leaders. Joe Toker is professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. I asked him if there would be any significant breakthroughs in Bali.
In terms of potential efforts and behind the closed doors ambitions to try and move the Ukrainian tragedy into some more constructive rails. I had the feeling watching the meeting between President Xi and President Biden yesterday that some of it, at least at the facade, was achieved. I had a similar feeling watching from distance, obviously, the meeting between President Xi and President Macron this morning. The language is, in a way, more than the banal, polite, the language of the communiques, the preliminary remarks of both presidents, both for the US-China summit and the French-China summit. So I think there is goodwill. I think there is a common recognition by major world leaders that something has to be done in order to stop or at least divert some of those very bad energies which are right now over the Ukrainian battlefield into something which would resemble more of the diplomacy, negotiations. Perhaps the term is not yet negotiations, but rather discussions, to do something in order to put the protagonists on a discussion orbit.
How significant is the France-China relationship, and how would you characterize the state of the diplomatic relationship as it stands now?
Well, it's a rough period on international macro relations, and even before the war, before February of this year, the beginning of the Ukraine-Russian war, due to the COVID crisis. And let us remember that even before the COVID crisis, there were unpleasant moments in the relations between China and the EU in general, but specifically France and Germany and Britain to some extent, although Britain is not a member of the EU. So these are relatively rough times in comparison to, say, the period, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. So the language is more rigid, and the possibilities of great breakthroughs in bilateral and multilateral agreements is perhaps more reduced now than a few years ago. Having said that, and again to the impression I expressed a minute ago regarding the goodwill and the ambitious tone of at least President Xi, President Biden, and President Macron, don't speak about others, there are chances that something may come out of it. It perhaps won't be visible right away, and it may stay in sort of an intermediary state of affairs before concrete things could be traced down, and perhaps diplomacy will talk rather than cannons.
You're watching CGTN, still to come. We're in New York next as Amazon plans to cut thousands of jobs amid slowing sales and an economic downturn.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with global business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Economic growth in the Eurozone slowed to 0.2% in the third quarter, according to the European Commission.
That's compared with 0.8% in the second quarter. The EU forecasts a recession at the end of this year and the beginning of 2023.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Alex Cadier, who's in Brussels. So, Alex, put these figures into context for us.
Yeah, well, what we thought was going to happen actually happened. The European Commission had forecast 0.2% growth for this quarter, and that's exactly the statistics that we had from Eurostat, the European Union Statistics Authority, today. 0.2% down from 0.8% in the last quarter. But the broader picture, the context that you mentioned there, is that this may be the last quarter of growth for the Eurozone until spring of next year, until we get through the winter. That very same forecast that said it would be 0.2% growth this quarter is saying it's going to be a shrinking of the economy next quarter and in the first 3 months of next year. So that would technically mean the European Union enters, or the Eurozone I should say, enters its first recession in quite a few years now, and that would be quite a serious problem. Now, the forecasts also say, and this is quite going further into the distance now, is that after those 2 quarters of shrinking, we would see a growth again. They're forecasting 0.3% growth for 2023. Now, that's tiny, but it's certainly better than a recession. So what they're predicting and what they're forecasting at the moment is going to be a short, sharp recession for the Eurozone. Now, short, sharp is certainly better than what we've seen in the last decade and what we saw after the financial crisis of 2008, but it will still affect businesses across the continent, particularly those that are struggling with rising energy costs, and if they see their economic activity diminish, that may be a real problem. The other bit of information we got from Eurostat today is that employment is also up 0.3% across the bloc, and that at least shows that even though we're expecting some economic downturn, that hasn't quite hit the jobs market yet.
And we have seen those high energy prices that we were seeing before come down a little, although they are very much still volatile. Will that improve the outlook?
It'll certainly be a relief for a lot of people and a lot of businesses. It'll certainly be a welcome short-term relief, but that dip in energy prices that we've seen in the last couple of weeks is actually more of a feat of circumstance rather than anything else. It's not mission accomplished. Europe hasn't figured out exactly how to restructure its energy industry, and so we're not resting on, the EU is not resting on its laurels when it comes to that slight decrease in energy prices. As you know, the European Union and other places rushed after the invasion of Ukraine to replace the fossil fuels they received from Russia. That included purchasing liquid natural gas in huge ships, huge tankers, bringing liquid natural gas to Europe. And actually, in the last few weeks, Europe has effectively filled its gas reserves to the brim. That was the objective they had in the last few months, and they did that very quickly, faster than expected. And part of the reason why there is now an oversupply, there's almost, in the short term at least, too much gas, is because you had these big tankers, these big ships coming into Europe, queuing in to deliver this gas to European markets. And actually, there has been quite a mild autumn. It's been quite warm for the last few weeks, so people haven't whacked on the heating, or industries haven't needed to push their consumption up so much. So you had these full reserves that didn't need filling anymore, and a mild temperatures across the continent that meant that people weren't cranking up the heating. That will change, as you'd expect, when the winter gets colder. We're expecting colder temperatures even just here in Brussels in the coming days, and that will certainly change the consumption. And so that will be a welcome relief. It'll certainly be help. We know that inflation, for example, is very much driven by energy prices in Europe. Short-term relief, but not a structural long-term solution that Europe is so desperate for.
Alec, thank you very much. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels.
Paris has overtaken London as Europe's highest value stock exchange in a bitter blow for the British capital. The calculations come from Bloomberg, which says the shift is more to do with UK stocks weakening rather than France's rise. Well, our correspondent Catherine Drew is here to explain all. Catherine.
Well, thanks, Jamie. Well, let's take a look at these major European indices first. And closing the day, a bit of a mixed picture. As you can see, the FTSE was down while the DAX in Frankfurt, CAC 40, doing rather better. Now, the rivals continuing to trade as normal, but this belies a huge shift in fortunes as London, formerly Europe's most valued stock market, loses that title, which now goes to Paris Stock Exchange. According to Bloomberg, the combined value of shares in London is around $2.821 trillion, while France has squeaked ahead with a combined value of $2.823 trillion. Now, back in 2016, the year the UK narrowly voted to leave the European Union, London was worth around $1.5 trillion more than its French rival. So, what are the factors behind all this? Well, Brexit, a weak pound, recent market turbulence, the energy crisis and double-digit inflation are all playing a part. And with the UK expected to fall into recession this year, medium and smaller-sized companies have been hit very hard. Now, obviously, France is also exposed to some of the same economic shocks, but it does appear to have avoided a recession even while lowering its economic forecast for 2023. Meanwhile, Paris has been bolstered by its luxury goods makers, which have seen a bounce back in demand from China. Pre-pandemic, China accounted for over a third of global demand for luxury goods. In the first 6 months of the year, shares in LVMH, owners of Louis Vuitton, they're up 22%, while Hermes is up 37%. Now, analyst research released just today, Jamie, predicts that the luxury sector is going to rise between 3 and 8% next year. So obviously, that is very good news for the Paris Stock Exchange. Back to you.
Catherine, thank you very much for that. Our correspondent Catherine Drew. Let's now talk to Justin Urquhart-Stewart, the co-founder of Seven Investment Management. Justin, welcome back to the programme. How significant is this? Is this significant?
Oh, it is significant because there have been some very major changes, not least of which, of course, the word that very few people talk about in Britain these days, which, of course, is Brexit, which was supposed to create so much more benefit, wasn't it? But, of course, actually what it's done was actually pushed away certain investments elsewhere and over to continental Europe. However, London shouldn't necessarily despair. It's still the most international market in the world. You go to Paris and you generally get, well, French companies. You go to New York and, again, it's American. Britain is still by far the most international. But you can see when you look at whether it's the AIM market, the smaller companies market, the FTSE 250 index have been very heavily hit. Not unsurprisingly, because the outlook for the UK economy at the moment isn't exactly rosy. So that, with the level of inflation, and as we were just saying, what's happened with the euro against sterling, has all led to this weakness. But the question is, can London really show itself again to be back as being a proper international business, international centre, which can attract more investment? And the answer is yes, it can, but it's got to do some reforms in order to do so.
At the risk of trivialising it and making it sound like some sort of motor race, I mean, is this a temporary position? I mean, can there be another switch of status where London regains its position?
Yeah, I think there probably will be, because you've seen certain sectors doing rather badly on the UK one, and obviously, as you were just hearing about the luxury markets in France, those companies doing really rather well, and will probably continue to do so if the European economy, particularly France, recovers as we expect next year. But longer term, London is still going to be much more international. It's a much more liquid market, and of course is much more international in terms of currencies, as well as all the other supporting insurance and liquidity facilities that are necessary. So Paris and Berlin and those other ones will still grow, but they don't have the depth of international facilities that London's got.
It's sometimes said, isn't it, that Britain has this rather schizophrenic relationship with wealth creation and the City of London. I mean, some critics of the UK will suggest that Britain's over-reliance, perhaps, on the financial sector has come at the price of other regions of the UK and other sectors in the UK. Is that fair?
Well, to a great extent it is fair. One of the issues you look at, back in 1945, which I'm pleased to say I can't remember, there were 45 stock exchanges in Britain, most of which were utterly useless, run by syndicates in red braces. Actually, there were about 7 regional exchanges, including the one I came from originally, which was actually Glasgow. And that's where we started AIM, a smaller companies market, it wasn't called then, but creating actually what the whole original idea of what a stock exchange for, which was to raise local income, local investment for local business. The problem that London and Britain has got, it is very, very London focused, it is too expensive, and it hasn't shown itself to be flexible enough. So that's where it needs to have more reforms coming through. And as it does that, then I'm afraid, well, it'll still attract some business, but won't fulfill its real opportunities.
Justin, you almost make it sound that this might be a good thing, that it's time for a reset to clear out some of the rubbish and then we can get back to business again. Is that what you're saying?
Heaven forfend I can't record investment managers and bankers as rubbish, but yes, there are some. No, we need to actually reform and change, and the City of London is not very good at doing it. We love going around in tricorn hats, I haven't got one, and with the Lord Mayor's show and things like that. And it's a great tradition, that's fantastic. But you need to have modern markets. We went through a big bang back in the 80s, and that was a great change. We need to go through another stage of that to have more investment coming through. There's no shortage of money. What we haven't got is the right infrastructure, the right financial plumbing to make sure it operates successfully, efficiently, much more cost efficiently.
Justin, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming back on the programme. Justin Urquhart-Stewart, co-founder of 7 Investment Management.
There are growing fears of a recession in Japan after the economy unexpectedly shrank for the first time this year. Third quarter figures show GDP fell by 0.3%, while it had been expected to grow by the same amount. Japan is the world's 3rd biggest economy. It's been hit hard by high inflation and global interest rate rises.
House prices in New Zealand have seen their biggest fall since the 1990s. The price of a home was down 10.9% from October last year. That's according to the Real Estate Institute. During the pandemic, New Zealand house prices rose by around 40%, to levels the central bank described as unsustainable.
China's economy suffered a slowdown last month as strict COVID curbs and sinking export demand took their toll. Retail sales had been forecast to rise by 1%, but they fell for the first time since May, while property investment fell at the fastest pace since 2020.
BMW has confirmed it'll invest another $1.4 billion in its electric vehicle battery factory in China. The German car maker says it's expanding its operations in the Guangdong province after signing an agreement on Friday. The factory makes batteries for BMW's i3 and iX3 vehicles.
E-commerce giant Amazon is preparing to lay off around 10,000 employees. It follows similar moves by other American tech companies, including Meta and Twitter, as a potential recession looms. Let's talk to our correspondent John Terrett in New York. So, John, Amazon laying off thousands of workers.
Yes. I know. We got this report just as the market closed last night. Around about 4 o'clock local time, the news filtered in, and there were a few gasps, I think, because it's quite a lot of people. But in the percentage terms, it ain't really that very much, as I will explain to you in just a second. But you're quite right. It's just the latest of a number of tech companies here who have begun laying off staff. Meta Platforms, which you know better as Facebook, of course, last week, getting rid of, what was it, 11,000 jobs, 13% of their workforce. Mark Zuckerberg putting his hands up and saying, look, it's all my fault. I'm terribly sorry. I've overspent. And they have overspent as well on the metaverse and also just on hiring. I mean, they almost double, I think more than doubled their staff in the 2 years of the COVID crisis. Extraordinary. Anyway, so that's Meta. Twitter, of course, you know about only too well, with Elon Musk laying off pretty much half the staff a couple of Fridays ago. And even Microsoft, you know, Mr. Softy, as it's known here, and even the Disney Corporation, Walt Disney, they're all talking about either cutting jobs or having some kind of hiring freeze. Now, my understanding is that these Amazon jobs are going to go in 2 key areas. One is corporate, so that'll be at headquarters in Seattle and wherever they have a corporate management base around the world, and also technology. Now, it's 10,000 in total. That's the largest number of layoffs they've ever had. What I don't know is whether they're going to cut back on the number of seasonal workers they take on, because they take on thousands of people just to get them through the Christmas holidays. I'm not sure about that. But according to the New York Times, the jobs are going to go in the Alexa division. You know Alexa, which you have in your kitchen? It's called the devices unit, so they're vulnerable. Some people in retail are vulnerable, which is why I question the number of people they take on in November and December. And human resources as well, they're vulnerable too. So it's only about 1% of the workforce globally and 3% of the corporate workforce. Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon back in 1994 when none of us knew what on earth he was on about, and of course he's grown it into this global behemoth. He tweeted within the past 24 hours to say that probabilities that the economy are pointing to mean you need to batten down the hatches, he said. So they're obviously preparing for a recession at some point. Of course, it's not his job anymore. It's the job of Andy Jassy, who used to head up AWS, which is the Amazon Web Services division. I doubt there'll be very many job cuts there, because that is a key driver of Amazon's earnings every quarter. A lot of people don't realize this, that it's got a huge web division, a cloud division, I should say, and it's very, very profitable. And of course, all this is fitting in with what the Federal Reserve wants, with this extraordinary situation that we have now, where in order to combat 40-year high inflation, the central bank, which basically has two roles, one is the money supply and the other one is to keep full employment, actually doesn't want full employment. It wants people laid off in order that we might bring down this recession. It's extraordinary times we live in.
Well, John, let's talk some more about the Amazon billionaire Jeff Bezos, because he's giving those billions away.
Yes. By the way, I must just correct myself. In order to bring down this inflation, I meant to say just now, and hopefully avoid a recession. Well, Jeff Bezos is doing what Roger Daltrey sang about in the 70s, giving it all away. He's given it all away, we are told. You may have different figures there, but I've got it at $124 billion. That's how much his fortune is worth. So let's assume he's going to give away about $100 billion of it. His targets, apparently, are climate change and inequality issues around the world. Now, climate change activists have been pressuring him lately because of Blue Origin. Now, Blue Origin is this space company he's got, this space tourism company that he's got down in the south of America, where people go up just for 5 or 6 minutes and they experience weightlessness and they come back down again. It's a rival in part to SpaceX and certainly to Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic. But of course, when you send one of those things up, you are polluting the atmosphere. You're putting lots of carbon particles into the atmosphere. So climate people say, well, how can you do that? How can you have a rocket company and also apparently be sort of, environmentally friendly? So obviously climate change is a key target for him. He's a bit late to the party, though, one way and another, because a lot of billionaires have been doing this for a while now. Bill Gates of Microsoft, and Warren Buffett, who they call the Sage of Omaha, who heads up Berkshire Hathaway, major octogenarian investor here in America. And finally, giving away money is easier said than done. You would think, wouldn't you? You would think it would be easy, and actually it's not, because you need to have a company in order to do it, or maybe a trust or some other structure. And then you have to think, okay, so I've got $100 billion. How much of that do I invest and then give away the interest that we make on that premium? And how much do we actually give away physically? I mean, it's an enormously difficult task, and it'll keep him busy until he's well into his 90s. And just quickly, when he launched Blue Origin a couple of months ago, at one of those events, I think when William Shatner went up, he suddenly gave away $100 million to two people. One was Jose Andres, the chef who runs the World Central Kitchen, where they go to disaster areas and cook for people. And the other one was, funnily enough, a CNN contributor called Van Jones, who suddenly had $100 million to spend on social issues. Whatever he wanted, Jeff Bezos would not intervene. So we had a hint then of this kind of behavior and the plans he might have had in mind.
John, thank you very much. Our correspondent John Terrace in New York.
Delegates at the United Nations climate talks in Egypt say they're hopeful of progress after that meeting of President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden at the G20 in Bali. Many countries in the global south are urging richer countries to fulfill their promises of further cuts in emissions and more financial support.
They argue that an agreement between China and the United States could help. The European Union's leading environmental official said the EU is already set to go beyond its existing target for reducing greenhouse gases.
So don't let anybody tell you, here or outside, that the EU is backtracking. Don't let them tell you that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is killing the European Green Deal, that we are in a dash for gas. No, Europe is staying the course. Actually, we're even accelerating.
Tamar Zandberg is Israel's Environment Protection Minister and has been at the COP27 talks in Sharm el-Sheikh. I asked her if there was now more optimism around them after the positive signs from President Xi Jinping's meeting with President Joe Biden.
I did meet with the special envoy of China and of the U.S. actually, and I think they were quite optimistic about the agreements between the U.S. and China even before the meeting. So I guess that probably kind of lifted the mood, but I guess the next few days will be crucial.
So what's the biggest challenges facing your country when it comes to climate change?
The time for delivery.
Okay, so I think our country has two main challenges. One, of course, is domestic. We aligned with the net zero by 2050, and we have the challenge of doing all efforts to stand up to that challenge. Being a growing country in terms of population, and that is not a very easy challenge. And on the other hand, I think that in the background of COP in our region, in the Middle East, our challenge would be to enhance our regional cooperation and see that we meet the challenge of climate together with our neighbors, with Egypt, with Jordan, many countries of the region.
And in some ways, Israel seems to be putting politics aside in order to work with its close neighbours on climate change. How important is cooperation there, do you think?
I think it's very important. I actually think it's a key. You know, with looking at climate, we sometimes look to Europe or to the US to see the standards and what the big countries are doing. But actually, we share the climate with the countries of the region. We share the desert and the sea and the rising temperature. And these are challenges that I think no country can face alone. And regional cooperation makes a lot of sense in that respect because we're just close to each other, we share the challenges, and if we share the problems, we can also share the solutions.
So what is Israel doing about its own climate change issues? Has it started early enough, and is it doing enough now?
Yeah, I think it's a common knowledge that Israel joined in a little late. But I am proud to report that this last year has been very busy in terms of both mitigation and adaptation. We started rolling a climate law. We had billions of shekels invested in preventing fires and floods, in shading, in decreasing the heat waves and heat islands. And there is still a lot more to do. And we hope to keep up, and we also hope that our advantage, that is our innovation and technology, can serve not only Israel's mitigation and adaptation, but also be a solution to move the needle in the region and globally.
So what would you like to see emerge from this COP27?
I think that the countries participating in the negotiation are going between keeping the 1.5 alive, enhancing the efforts of mitigation, and actually making their commitments even more ambitious on the one hand, and on the other hand, asking themselves questions of environmental justice, of what is called the loss and damage. How is the developing countries that contribute so little to the crisis but are so very vulnerable? And I think if we can, as the world, as the global effort, can combine the two, see who is suffering from what and how we can reach out, I think that would be a great success. We still have 3 or 4 days to go to see if we can, as humanity, live up to the biggest challenge that we have created, and now we have to to solve.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, as the United Nations backs reparations to rebuild Ukraine, the people of Irpin prepare for a winter with no heating and no hot water.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be, CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. China's President Xi Jinping calls for unity to deal with the food and energy crisis facing the world.
Our other headlines: Ukraine continues to overshadow the G20 as world leaders meet in Bali. Russia attacks Kyiv and a number of other major cities.
And heading for a recession. Eurozone growth slumps to 0.2%. High energy prices play a pivotal role in what happens next.
Germany and Spain are to train thousands of Ukrainian troops under the largest ever military mission of its kind by the European Union.
EU defence leaders have announced that 15,000 troops will initially be trained in Poland. Spain has also announced plans for a new facility in the city of Toledo, training 400 troops every 2 months. The EU initiative to support Ukraine against the continued threat from Russia is being funded from the European Peace Facility at a cost of over $60 million a year.
Ukraine's president has put forward proposals to world leaders meeting at the G20 in Bali aimed at ending this conflict.
Volodymyr Zelensky unveiled a 10-point plan which he says offers a lasting peace based on international law. Ukraine is calling for the retreat of all Moscow-backed troops from its borders. It also wants a special tribunal to try Russian war crimes alleged to have been carried out in Ukraine.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Giles Gibson in Tallinn. Giles, first of all, tell us more about these plans and Russia's response.
Well, throughout his speech, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky referred to the G19, not the G20, which was clearly a snub to Russia, which is attending this summit in Bali. We saw throughout his speech Volodymyr Zelensky hitting a lot of the points that he's been talking about in terms of a potential peace deal over several months now, talking about restoring the territorial integrity of Ukraine. But he also put a lot of stress on food security, saying that he wants this deal that's been done to allow grain shipments from Ukraine's Black Sea coast to be extended indefinitely. It's worth noting that that deal is currently set to expire on the 19th of November, this Saturday, and it's been the subject of really intense negotiations to try and extend it into the next few months. Russian President Vladimir Putin is not attending this summit in Bali, is not at the G20, but he has sent his Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Take a listen to what he had to say in terms of what Russia wants in terms of extending that deal over grain shipments.
Our Turkish colleagues and Western colleagues understand that they must keep Ukraine from undertaking any such unacceptable acts. The second part of the deal was the removal of obstacles to the export of Russian grain. And here we must say thank you to the UN Secretariat and the Secretary-General personally. They're trying their best, but 5 months have passed and no practical results have been achieved.
Giles, G20 members in Bali are expected to back a resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How much of a setback would that be for Moscow?
It would be a very significant step, but I do think we have to point out that this is just a draft resolution, that on the Wednesday, on the next day of this G20 summit, there's going to be a lot of haggling, a lot of dispute and discussion over the exact wording of that joint statement. If we even get one at these summits, sometimes we don't even get all of the countries able to coalesce. The Reuters news agency has seen a draft statement. This is what it says. Most members strongly condemned the war in Ukraine, and there's another line that there were other views and different assessments, of the situation and the sanctions. The big question is whether Russia would even be prepared to sign a document like that that acknowledges that the entire G20 doesn't condemn the war in Ukraine. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been critical of Western nations so far over the course of the attempt to get to some sort of a joint statement. He has accused them of politicising the resolution, which we are expecting, if it does happen, to emerge some point on Wednesday.
Giles, thank you for that. Our correspondent Giles Gibson in Tallinn.
The United Nations has passed a resolution that would mean Russia paying to rebuild Ukraine when the war ends. Ukraine's ambassador to the UN told the Assembly that everything from factories to hospitals had been destroyed after months of shelling, and that Russia must be held accountable. The Kremlin says it will do everything it can to stop Russia's international reserves from being seized to pay for reparations. Well, our correspondent Shamim Chowdhury is in Kyiv. First of all, Shamim, fresh Russian airstrikes have been reported in Kyiv. What can you tell us?
That's right, Robin. The President, Volodymyr Zelensky, has described these airstrikes that went on for 4 hours at least as far worse than those that occurred on the 10th of October. Now, he says at least 85 rockets have hit not just Kyiv, but major cities across the country. For the past few hours, we have been taking shelter in a safe part of the building that we're staying in. When we came out to talk to you, the country had still been on high alert. That's actually been switched off literally just a few minutes ago. We know that 3 residential buildings at least have been hit by Russian missiles. 1 fatality so far. Still, in terms of the rescue process, it's still quite a fluid situation, so it may well be that those numbers do go up. We also know that several missiles, at least 4 or so, were deflected by air defense systems here in Kyiv. The 3 buildings that were attacked are actually in the district that we're in, Pechersk, which is quite central. We're in the kind of northern tip of that district, and we know that at the moment the ambulance services and the police services are at the sites. The buildings were set on fire. There were several huge fires in the city. Other cities that were affected were Lviv, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv down in the south, Zaporizhzhia also down in the south. Kyiv is 50% of Kyiv is without power at the moment, and we're told that of the 3 metro lines, 1 of them is completely out of service, and yet there are people still down there who took shelter from the missiles.
And this is, of course, just one day in months of fighting. Just how badly has Ukraine's infrastructure been damaged by this war?
Well, officials have told us that in October, at least 200 power stations, power sites were damaged, 28 of them completely destroyed. Now, some of those have been fixed, they have been rebuilt, but still around 30% of the Ukrainian population, it's about 35 million or so, is without power at least some part of the day. We travelled to a town called Irpin, which was the site of very heavy fighting between the Ukrainians and the Russians back in March. And we found that many people there are still trying to cope with the onset of winter. It's very, very cold, but many of them, I should say, still don't have heating or electricity for large parts of the day. This is our report.
For many residents of Irpin, this winter will be their bleakest yet. Their town was the scene of fierce fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces in March. Darina Mikhailishin's home was destroyed after being caught in the crossfire. She and her husband Yuri Sikan are now forced to live in an unheated caravan.
We wear extra layers of clothes thanks to donations from volunteers. We always light a fire in our yard to keep our hands warm. It's much colder living in a caravan than in a house because it's made of metal and chipboard. When temperatures drop to below zero, it'll be impossible to live here.
More than 3,000 buildings were damaged here during the fighting, and more than 300 people lost their lives. Like many parts of Ukraine, Irpin lost much of its electricity after Russian forces attacked the country's power supplies. Around 30% of the country's power plants have been completely or partially destroyed since early October, causing massive blackouts across the country. Irpin now has scheduled power cuts every 4 hours, but there's always a risk that even this won't last.
The electricity network in the Kyiv region, as well as the rest of the country, is all interconnected. That means if our neighbouring village of Makariv comes under attack, it will directly impact us here in Irpin, and we too will lose electricity.
The local authority has provided temporary shelters for those who have lost their homes. Electricity is the only source of energy here.
The problem is the materials these structures are made of don't retain heat. It means as soon as the electricity goes down, they start cooling down, and the inside becomes as cold as outside.
Irina Sabyeniva's apartment was burnt down during the fighting. She moved here in July after staying with friends for a few months.
Sometimes it even gets wet inside my room. When it rains, water leaks in. Because of this, we get a lot of mildew and mould on our shoes and everywhere else.
For older people, the winter brings with it health problems. In the past, the large open fire inside her house helped alleviate Darina's joint pains. Now, this paltry outdoor replacement is all she has to ease her suffering.
So, Robin, this is really a snapshot of what people across the country are experiencing, and the weather will get colder. It's already very, very cold, and we can expect it to drop quite considerably over the next few months or so. Authorities are doing what they can to repair kind of electricity and provide heat, but they're saying that they don't have enough resources and they're just not working fast enough.
Shamim Chowdhury in Kyiv, thank you very much.
Another Donald Trump-endorsed candidate has been defeated in the midterm elections in the United States. Democrat Katie Hobbs beat Republican Carrie Lake, making her the first Democratic governor of Arizona since 2006. Lake falsely claimed Trump won the 2020 election. The Republicans are just one seat away from retaking the House of Representatives after wins in California and New York.
Israel says it will not cooperate with an FBI inquiry into the killing of a Palestinian-American reporter. Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh was shot during an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank in March. Israel says the investigation is a mistake and interference in internal affairs.
Flash flooding has brought chaos to Australia's most populous state. Emergency evacuations are underway in parts of New South Wales after the region's biggest river burst its banks. This is the fourth major flooding event in Australia this year, with heavy rain leaving schools closed and homes without power.
21-time tennis Grand Slam champion Novak Djokovic will be able to play at next year's Australian Open after his 3-year visa ban was overturned. Former world number one was deported from Australia days before this year's tournament over his COVID vaccination status. Australia has since scrapped a rule requiring international visitors to disclose if they've been vaccinated.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, is there room for all of us? And who will look after us when we get old? The world welcomes its 8th billionth person.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw. The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. So it's official. As of today, the 15th of November 2022, the world's population has risen above 8 billion people. That's more than 3 times the number in 1950, when there were just 2.5 billion people. The UN Population Division says this is just the beginning, as the number of people will continue to grow for decades. Life expectancy is set to increase to an average of 77.2 years by 2050. Peak population will be reached around 2080, when there will be around 10.4 billion of us. Those are the global figures, but there are regional variations. The UN expects that more than half of population growth by 2050 will come from just 8 countries: the Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines and Tanzania. And it also warns that as fertility rates fall, the world is going to get older. By 2050, 16% of the world's population will be aged over 65, up from 10% today. Well, China has been the world's most populous country for hundreds of years, but that's set to change in early 2023, when the UN predicts that India's population will surpass China's. Our correspondent Ravinder Bawa reports from Delhi.
Nikita is struggling to find a job for more than 6 months. She has a master's degree and the certificates of eligibility to teach. Yet, she is still unemployed. Teaching jobs in India are scarce. Millions of Indians like Nikita are a part of the youth bulge. More than 70% of the population in India is below the age of 35. To reap this unique opportunity, the policy makers will have to think out of the box.
Well, I would say this large young demographic already exists. Whether it's going to be a dividend or a disaster is something that will be determined by the investments that are made by the state in their health, their well-being, opportunities for them.
The UN projects that India's population will rise from the present 1.4 billion people to surpass China next year. It will grow to about 1.7 billion by 2050. India is just beyond the midpoint of its demographic dividend. The government needs to increase the GDP and reduce poverty to make the best of this opportunity. Experts say that the main challenge will be to create jobs for so many.
And the last 8 years is considerably on the point of realization of benefits in terms of new employment creation, upward income mobility, of the young, working class. We've lost the ship there. It's just, as I said, it's a point of inflection now. Whatever we choose to do in terms of policy-making decisions will have serious ramifications, not just for the young, but also for the old.
To capitalize on the youth potential, India will have to make a major policy shift from capital-intensive manufacturing to labor-intensive manufacturing. Ravinder Bawa, CGTN, Delhi.
John Wilmoth is director of the United Nations Population Division. He spoke to CGTN's Juliet Mann about our growing population.
Even though we're able to grow the amount of food that's needed to feed this growing population, even if that's possible, we have to think about what the consequences of that are. And the food system currently contributes about between a quarter and a third of the greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere today. About a quarter to a third of that comes from the food system. That includes not only production, but also distribution and storage and everything that is part of the food system. So, very broadly, we need to think about how that system works, because probably we cannot reach the climate goals that we have unless there are changes also in agriculture and how the whole food system is managed. And so that's a major issue. We may be able to support this many people on the planet. We may be able to keep them alive. We may be able to continue increasing their life expectancies. But we need to think about what are the after effects of all that human activity and consumption. I think people used to be worried about running out of resources and not being able to grow enough food and not being able to find enough oil or sources of energy. That's not really the problem in the end. Humans are very clever about and resourceful about finding the resources that are needed in order to continue improving the quality of life for human beings and continuing to raise life expectancy around the world. That's not the problem. The problem is, what are the after effects of all that consumption and economic activity? How are we changing the world around us? How are we changing the atmosphere in particular, and the impact that that's having on climate, and the impact that the climate change is having on people's lives across the board. And so the risk is not one of, it's not that we won't be able to continue growing. The question is, what will be the impacts of that growth and the quality of the life that we will create for ourselves and for other species on this planet if we continue acting as we are? We should be focusing on the per capita impact on the environment rather than the number of people. And, that's true because over time, the increase has been much more in terms of consumption and income and everything that we do that impacts the environment on a per capita basis. That has been changing much more than the increase of the human population.
And you can see much more of that interview in the agenda with Juliet Mann this weekend here on CGTN.
The headlines again. China's President Xi Jinping calls for unity to deal with the food and energy crisis facing the world.
Our other headlines: Ukraine continues to overshadow the G20 as world leaders meet in Bali. Russia attacks Kyiv and a number of other major cities.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN is Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.